Hello, everyone. This is meant to be a brief introduction on Hill's essay on respect for persons. Must we respect everyone? We'll pick up the discussion Friday, but I thought we might begin with some themes and some background. So, some of you who have taken my Intro 102 have met the deferential housewife, and this is someone who does everything her husband wants. She does it because he wants. She does it without question. She watches the movies she wants. She eats the food he wants. If he wants kids, she has them. She does anything and everything her husband might ask her to do. And Hill's question is, what's wrong with her behavior? What's she doing wrong? And one of the things that Hill wants to suggest is that it may not be that she's doing anything wrong if we're thinking of it in terms of action, but the real test is whether she has a value for herself as a person. For example, it may be that she's considered her situation, she's done what Frankfurt has said, and she's taken herself seriously. She's reflected on the raw material, her raw psychic material, and she's decided that she wants to live this kind of life. She wants to live a life in which she is subservient to her husband. Now, Hill would take exception to this choice, but the important thing to understand about the deferential housewife is that she's made the choice. She's voluntarily made the decision to value herself enough, to take herself seriously enough, that she makes the decision that she wants to live this particular lifestyle. And so when Hill says the deferential housewife lacks self-respect, what he's thinking is that she hasn't even given herself permission. She hasn't valued herself enough as a person to give herself permission to consider how her life should go. So, what kind of mistake is she making, or why think that she ought to respect herself? And here, if you look at the slide, you have what Hill calls a Kantian argument for respect. The argument goes something like this. All people have basic rights, and here he's thinking about basic dignity as people, right? So there's something in the mere membership of the human community, or being a human person, that gives us a value. I should pause because in the must respect be earned piece, he's making a slightly different argument, but it's consistent with this. The idea is that we all have rights. The second premise is that everyone has an obligation to recognize the rights of others. So people are valuable. We ought to recognize that value. And the third premise is that, well, if people don't avow their basic rights, if they disavow them, if they don't pay attention to them, if they don't take themselves seriously, right, then they're making a moral mistake. What's the mistake? Well, according to Hill, the mistake is they're not standing up for everyone. They're disregarding the value of a particular person. Now, it's going to turn out that the person that she's not valuing is herself, but for Hill, it's irrelevant. For Hill, we have a universal duty to recognize the value and dignity of everyone, and we can't give it up, including the deferential housewife. She has a duty to respect the value of everyone, including herself, and this requires considering how she might like her life to go. And because she doesn't do that, Hill says she lacks self-respect. Of course, Hill is making what he calls a Kantian argument, and there's many things that we could say about Kant. Many who have taken my History of Ethics course have read large bits of Kant. Kant is famous for promoting a universal ethics, that is to say, an ethics that applies anywhere, all times, to everyone. Unlike Frankfurt, Kant's universal ethics is grounded in reason. That's in part because he's worried about the unreliability of feelings. Sometimes it's said of Kant that he doesn't believe in compassion, doesn't believe in empathy, doesn't believe in sympathy, wouldn't want us to act out of love for others. I don't actually think that's accurate. I think a more accurate account of what Kant's view is that we're not always compassionate. We don't always feel the love of others, even the love of our families. And what Kant is quite concerned to establish is that we have a duty or we have a reason to act on behalf of others, even when we don't feel like it. I ought to take care of my child even if I don't love her. I ought to take care of my friends even if I'm mad at her. Right? The idea is that if we have a duty, the duty applies to us regardless of whether we want to do it, regardless of whether we feel like we should do it. If we rely on feelings, the reasons might not be present, so he wants to find a kind of reason that doesn't appeal to feelings. Kant is also worried about what we might call ad hoc social norms. The idea is that many social conventions are going to run parallel to legal norms. They're going to run parallel to moral norms. So, for example, it's a bad idea to steal. Custom tells us we shouldn't steal. Our parents tell us we shouldn't steal. We shouldn't lie. We shouldn't do all kinds of things, right? And so if you see someone stealing, one of the things that's wrong with it is it disobeys the law. A second thing is wrong with it is, that's not how people act around here. That's not what being a good member of society requires. Being a good member of society requires that you don't steal people's stuff, you respect people's property and that sort of thing. But one of the things that Kant worries about is that sometimes we just get lucky if the moral norms happen to be the right ones, or if the social norms and the moral norms happen to match up. Because what would we do in a society that didn't value property, or a society that didn't value friendship, or a society for much of human history that didn't value women, or didn't value certain racial groups, right? These are ones, if you look at sexism, for example, or practices of racism, you might say, and social norms were your standard of acceptability, you said, look, custom is that women aren't allowed to vote, women aren't allowed to hold property, women aren't allowed to get an education. That's how we've done things. That's how women and men in this community agree to do things. And Kant says, well, for all that, social norms can get it wrong. And if you look at social norms as the litmus test for right and wrong, morally speaking, you're going to miss something important. And so he's looking for another way to ground ethics, another way to make sense of what morality might require of us. And so in that sense, what he does is he seeks to transcend common morality. Common morality we might think of in his terms here as social norms. Those kinds of rules that we grew up thinking about, those rules we grew up believing. But he wants to transcend them. Notice he doesn't want to necessarily reject them because they might get him right. But he wants to find a norm that's going to apply to all of us, that's going to be universal. Some of you might have heard me talk about this in terms of the zip code problem. One of the things that bothers Kant is that you can have something like same-sex marriage that's allowed in this community, but it's not allowed in a community, right down the street. And what Kant wants to say is, I don't know whether same-sex marriage is right or not, but it shouldn't depend on where you happen to live. It shouldn't depend on your zip code. Right? We can take the question of whether same-sex relationships are appropriate or same-sex marriage is appropriate, and we can consider it on its merits. And once we consider it on its merits, then that result applies anywhere and everywhere. Once we decide that women are capable of doing math, that women are capable of doing public policy, that women are capable of having an education, of holding jobs, of holding public office, right? Then that result should apply anywhere and everywhere. So in that sense, Kant is looking for a universal ethics, principles that apply anywhere and everywhere, principles that are universal. I could go into lots of detail about Kant's categorical imperative. Notice this is his way of understanding what universal means. Categorical just means, another word for sort of universal. It's not hypothetical. It's not dependent upon contingent circumstances. Imperative you can just think of as a rule or a principle. So one formulation says, act as if that maxim of your action were to become, through your will, a universal law of nature. The basic idea is imagine that everyone was doing this simultaneously. Right? Imagine that in his case, everyone was committing suicide. Is suicide a rational thing? Well, imagine if everyone did it. It would be a world in which there were no longer any people. So in that sense, it violates a law of nature. Or imagine a world in which everyone were simultaneously lying. For him, that doesn't work, or that is a world in which you can't even make a lie. Why? Well, because language and communication would completely break down if people were consistently lying. Notice the idea is that these practices, suicide, lying, and most anything else we might consider, might be self-defeating. They might not be capable of sustaining practice universally. And if it can't be universalized, then it ought to be rejected, according to Kant. A second formulation says what's wrong with lying is not that everybody can't do it simultaneously, but rather that you're misusing people. And so the idea is that we ought to treat people as ends, we ought to treat them with dignity, and we shouldn't use them for our own self-interested purposes. We shouldn't use them as a means towards our ends, but rather what we should do is we should respect them as ends in themselves. That is to say, we should respect them as people in their own right. A third formulation appeals to the autonomy of individuals, and the idea is this is appealing to the rationality of individuals, and says, look, individuals ought to be able to think about what's right, what's not right, and if they think about it, he thinks that individuals are going to come to roughly the same kinds of decisions about stealing being wrong, murder being wrong, lying being wrong, and that sort of thing. And so the fancy language, the idea of the will of every rational being as a will that legislates law, it's just roughly we as rational beings considering the legislation or considering the rules that ought to govern us. And he thinks that once people reflect, they're going to figure out how we ought to behave. The fourth formula is one in which it sort of builds on the third, and the idea is imagine you had a community of rational agents. Imagine you had anyone and everyone get together and talk about the rules that ought to govern society. What he thinks is this kind of hypothetical arrangement in which everyone is considering how we ought to be behaved is one in which we'd come up with certain objective standards. We'd reject lying, we'd reject stealing, we'd recognize that women should have the right to vote, and so on. And because everyone is making this decision, right, everyone is involved, and because everyone is involved and everyone agrees, at least under these hypothetical kinds of circumstances, it's universal. So again, Kant believes he's providing sort of a universal standard of ethics. One way of understanding this universal agreement, so there have been plenty of folks who would suggest that we don't have universal agreement. A contemporary moral philosopher, John Rawls, he's actually dead now, but in a famous book in 1972, he argued for principles of justice that he thought anyone and everyone would agree to, and he proposed the following thought experiment. What he suggested was, imagine that you're in a position where you're deciding the rules that should govern society. Imagine that was in your power to decide the rules that govern society. Now, if you knew who you were in society, you might want to stack the deck in your favor, right? So I'm a bald nerd, right? The nerd part means I might want, I don't know, tax and breaks for nerds, or I might want to give, high salaries to nerds or something like that. I don't know what you do with my being bald, but the point is, if we knew about our interests, we might try to stack the deck so that the rules favored us, much like in a game, if we were deciding the rules of a game. If we knew what our strengths and talents were, we might try to fix the rules of the game in a way that benefited us. So Rawls is thinking about the rules, but he's sensitive to the fact that we know who we are, we know where our positions are, and human nature being what it is, it's not likely to generate fairness. So what he came up with is what he calls the veil of ignorance. And the idea is this. Imagine you know everything you know about society. You know about racism, sexism, homophobia. You know that some people are rich and some people are poor and some people are disabled and some people are educated and some aren't, and so on. So you know everything you know about the world. But there's one thing you don't know. And the thing you don't know is which person you are. So you know you're rich, you're poor, you're black, you're white, you're male, you're female, you're gay, you're straight. You have some amount of money in your bank account, but you don't know how much. So imagine you don't know who precisely you are, but you're charged with trying to figure out basic principles of fairness. And what Rawls says, and I invite you to think about it, but what Rawls concludes is that no matter who you are, you're going to look out for the least advantaged members of society. You're going to look out for the most vulnerable people. Why? Well, because when the veil of ignorance is lifted, it could be you. That is to say, you might be that most vulnerable. And if you've constructed principles of fairness in a way that looks out for the most vulnerable, if it turns out you're most vulnerable, right, then you're taken care of. Right? Or at least then you're not disadvantaged by the fact that you happen to be gay in a homophobic society, or you happen to be a woman in a society that doesn't value women. Right? In particular, he thinks the two principles that we would all agree on is what he calls liberty and equality. The idea is that the liberty principle is roughly that we would want to be able to govern our lives. We want to make decisions for ourselves about who we marry, about our kinds of career, whether we go to college or not. Right? We want to have some say over our life plan. And the second is equality. And before we get too worked up about thinking that Rawls is a socialist or some such thing, as if there was anything wrong with that. But before we get too worked up about that, it's important to understand that Rawls wants to argue for equal opportunity. And he's not saying that everyone will make the same amount of money, but rather he wants to say that principles of fairness demand that people have opportunities to education, they have opportunities to jobs, they have opportunities to work hard in a way that might help them become successful. Now, if you think about Rawls, take a step back from the particulars of Rawls, you can see that Rawls is very much offering something in the Kantian spirit. That is to say, these are basic principles that he thinks are universal. That is to say, they apply to anyone and everyone all the time. It's much like the first argument I gave from Hill, and much like what I sketched in favor or in relation to Kant. Now, if we turn to Hill's Must We Respect for Everyone, I want to point out just a few features in Hill's argument. The first is that he doesn't think that respect needs to be earned. And we can talk a little bit about the term respect having some sort of different definitions or being used in ordinary language in different ways. As Hill recognizes, it's possible for us to respect a person's ability, for example, as a tennis player or something. And what we're doing when we're respecting that is we're expecting their merit, he would say. They're good at a job. They're a good parent. They're a good judge. They're a good something, right? So they're good at their thing. Where respect is now an evaluation of their ability to do something well. This is a perfectly good understanding of what respect might mean, but it's not the sense that Hill wants to focus on. When Hill says respect doesn't need to be earned, what he's thinking of is a status claim, or he's thinking of a role. What he has in mind is we might respect the office of the presidency without respecting the particular occupant. We might respect the referee and the function referee plays in a game without respecting the particular calls of that person. Right? And in that sense, what we're doing is we're respecting an occupant of a role. We're valuing the occupant of a particular role. And yet what Hill wants to suggest is that respect, if by respect means merit, of course that has to be earned. But our status as human beings, does not have to be earned. And so when he says that respect does not need to be earned, right, he's thinking there's something that attaches to being a human being, right, that grounds our respect for persons. And notice how this is consistent with the previous argument of the deferential housewife that says we ought to respect everyone. The second piece, and this is the perhaps more controversial one, and one that we'll talk about on Friday, is that respect can't be forfeited. If we ought to respect everyone because they're valuable, you can't give it up. Notice the deferential housewife couldn't give up her value as a person, according to Hill, even though it was her own. She ought to recognize that she's a valuable person and make decisions about her life. Similarly, even the moral scum, quote unquote, ought to be respected, according to Hill. And notice it's because it's a value that attaches to everyone. Notice if we think back to Frankfurt, right? Frankfurt, I suggested, took Euthyphro's side of the problem and said something's valuable only if I happen to value it. There's not a property or a value that we appreciate in others. That would be an objective conception. But he wants to offer for the subjective. So Frankfurt says something is valuable if, subjectively speaking, it's valuable to me. Notice Hill's taking the other side. Hill's saying there is a quality possessed by human beings that's objectively valuable, and we ought to appreciate it. And the second point is that it's a property that we can't get rid of. We can't waive it. It attaches to us as human beings. Now, is it mere membership? Why is it that we ought to respect everyone? And here Hill's thinking it has to do with our ability to pursue projects. It has our ability to use reason to decide how we ought to live and so on. This is what makes us unique and special. And notice in that sense, Frankfurt can agree with that, or at least with parts of that. That part of what makes us unique and special, if you're Frankfurt, is our ability to make second-order endorsements or judgments about our psychic raw material. Hill has a similar kind of view. We look at our lives, we decide how we want it to go, and that's our status. That's what we're able to do. That's our role as human beings. And notice, by the way, that's why the deferential housewife is selling herself short. If she doesn't do that, then she's failing to live up to her potential as a project pursuer. Notice, as I suggest, there are different forms of respect. We can respect roles, president, judge, umpire. We can respect merit. You can be a good mother, a good president, a good judge, a good umpire, right? Those are different. So notice it's possible to recognize a role without merit. So I can respect the office of the presidency without respecting the person in it. It's also possible to recognize merit without valuing the particular role. And here we might say a skillful assassin. I can respect the fact that they're a good assassin without respecting their role as an assassin. And again, what Hill wants to argue is that we respect people's role as a human being, as a project pursuer. Notice that this is not mere membership in the community that we're valuing. It's not a claim that our lives will go better if we respect everyone. That's probably true. But he, like Kant, doesn't think the goal of our lives is to be happy. He rather thinks our goal is to live well. It's not grounded in sentiment. It's not because I have fellow feeling for my the other human beings around me. Again, Hill's not saying that there's anything wrong with human sentiment or fellow feeling, but like Kant, he doesn't want to rely on feelings that might be here today and not there tomorrow. It's not all for the human condition. It is true, says Hill, says Kant, says Rawls, that the human beings are awesome creatures. That is to say, we're pretty darn amazing when you think about the kinds of things that we're able to do. Right? And much like being awestruck by a natural wonder or a sunrise or something like that, you might think that when we appreciate the value of a thing, what we're appreciating is that quality that arrests our, takes our breath away, that makes us awestruck. Not what Hill wants to appreciate. Similarly, it's not our mere rational capacity. And this is important. For Hill, it is our rational capacity, or at least in part, but it's not simply the fact that we're rational. It's not that we happen to be rational creatures. Right? Rather, for Hill, We should respect, and now I'm quoting, we should respect all human beings because such respect is an essential part of the moral framework for deliberation to which we are in fact committed by our concept of ourselves as moral agents subject to duties, once this is properly understood. The important thing is that we are project pursuers. We are, in Frankfurt's terms, project pursuers that are capable of taking ourselves seriously and reflecting and of getting it right. And for Hill, that means identifying basic principles of morality that are in keeping with the basic value and dignity of our fellow human beings. Right? We understand ourselves. We understand what it means to be committed to morality by understanding what it means to be committed to our own value and the value of others. I want to offer two arguments that Hill is giving us, or kind of walk through two arguments that Hill, I think, is giving us for this claim that we ought to respect everyone. The first is what I'll call the argument for convergence. And here the idea is that reasonable and rational agents, after sober awareness of the details, are going to converge on a common set of guiding principles, right, after the sober awareness of those details. And this is kind of like the Kant kingdom of ends formulation. The idea, or even the Rawls kind of veil of ignorance, basic principles of fairness kind of position. And that is, we as rational beings can sit back, we can reflect, we can take ourselves seriously, and if we do that, what are we going to learn? If we do that, what are we going to figure out about principles to guide us? The first is that we recognize we have to set aside our self-interest. Notice it's not to say that we aren't self-interested creatures. Of course we are. It's not saying we don't ever act on self-interest. Of course we do. The point, however, is that sometimes doing the right thing requires making sacrifices for other people. Sometimes doing the right thing means taking a stand, even if it hurts our sort of narrowly construed self-interest. Right? That's the stuff of morality. Think about friendships. Think about taking a stand against racial or injustice, for example. It might not be easy to do. It might not be comfortable to do. But for all that might be the right thing to do. A second thing that Hill wants to suggest this argument from convergence establishes is that if we and our fellow rational creatures get together and decide the rules that are going to govern us, they're jointly authored. Now, there's no magic moment when everybody gets together and decides on these principles, but the point is, if we're all thinking about them and we're all roughly converging on similar principles, don't lie, don't steal, don't cheat, don't do, and then we list off a bunch of things, some of their authority is coming from us because we are the ones that decided these principles are good principles to govern us. Right? So they're not coming from the outside in the sense that Frankfurt said that rationality is imposing things on us. Right? Hill's response to that objection would be to say, well, no, actually they're coming on the inside because they're jointly authored by us. But because everyone's doing the authoring, the principles are universal. And because they're recognizing the universal value of all people, they're again universal, and they're also objective because they don't depend upon kind of the subjective feeling or belief of individuals. And the last point is that the recognition of these principles are jointly binding. Right? We all, at least sort of in a thought experiment sense, got together and decided what principles are going to govern us. And because we all got together, decided, and agreed, these principles are jointly binding. Right? They apply to all of us, even when we don't want them to. So I can recognize that stealing my neighbor's stuff is a bad idea, right? Because at a kind of level of abstraction, I recognize that's a bad idea. But just because it would be in my advantage to do it now doesn't mean it's a good idea for me to do it now. I still have to recognize that that would be unfair, that I wouldn't want her to do that to me, and so on. So they're binding even when it might be in my self-interest to do otherwise. And it's binding because I used my rationality to figure out these principles that govern us. Again, sober awareness of the details, Not everyone's going to engage in sober awareness of the details, but anyone who does is roughly going to converge on the same kinds of principles, the same kinds of ideas. The next argument is an argument from presumption. And this argument is, I think, different in many respects from the convergence argument. The first is, let me back up and make a distinction between dignity and price. This is a distinction that Kant makes. The basic idea is that most things in our lives we can buy and sell, we can use, and then we can discard. We can think about my car, we can think about a table, we can think about my computer, we can think about all kinds of the stuff, the material stuff in our lives. If I run my computer all of the time, I'm not torturing my computer because my computer's not sentient. My computer doesn't have the ability to reflect. If I decide I don't want, my barbecue grill, I put it on eBay and I see how much people are going to give me for it, right? Those things have price. Their value, right, is their use value, or their value is what eBay will pay me for them. They're not intrinsically valuable, they're only instrumentally valuable. That is to say, valuable in use, valuable in terms of what I can get on the exchange. For Kant, however, people have dignity. That is to say, people do not have use value, price value, exchange value. People have a completely different kind of value. They have dignity. Human beings are inherently valuable, according to Kant, and Hill agrees. Right? This is going to be important for reasons you'll see in just a moment. So, should we treat everyone as equal? Or why I think we should treat everyone as equal? Because after all, we know that everybody's not equally rational. Not everyone's able to soberly reflect. Not everyone's able to make careful decisions about the shape and direction of their life, right? What are we to do about those folks? And we can talk about the mentally infirm, we can talk about the elderly, we can talk about children, we can talk about sociopaths, psychopaths, that sort of thing. So maybe those folks are not exercising rationality in the right way, and because they're not exercising rationality in the right way, they're not expressing their value in the right way. And if they're not expressing their value in the right way, then maybe we don't have to respect them. The first line of response to that for Hill is that we don't actually know how much they can reason and how much they can't, or the extent to which they have some kind of quote-unquote defect, or their substandard reasoning. And we shouldn't be too quick to assume that because they're having trouble, they therefore don't deserve our respect, especially given that empirically speaking, it's hard to figure out. A related worry is that in the human history, there is a long and very nasty history of treating people that actually are rational as sub-rational, as subhuman. And we can think about, countless genocides. We can think about the treatment of women, for example, certainly racial groups and so on. And lots of instances, unfortunately, of man's inhumanity to man, as it were. Human beings treating other human beings as less than rational. So the empirical piece is we don't know how rational people are. And the nasty history piece says we're a little too quick to dehumanize people. Right? In a related vein, we wouldn't want other people to assume that we're less than rational, and we certainly wouldn't want to bear the brunt of a nasty history against us, right? We want people to respect us. Moreover, there's something strange about mistreating other people. It's not clear we can respect other people if we're it's not clear we can respect ourselves if we systematically disrespect other people. Right? As a point of integrity, it seems that we're making a mistake, not only for Hill's reasons in the deferential housewife piece, but also because it just doesn't speak well of us if we're willing to use and abuse, buy, sell, exchange other people. It doesn't seem to speak well of us. by analogy, the presumption argument, and this is, I'm saying analogy because Hill doesn't say it, but I think here's really what he's on about. If you think about innocent before proven guilty, the question is, where's the default? And many of us, especially in the United States, want innocent before proven guilty. You have to show that I'm guilty of a crime. Right? But the default suggests that I'm innocent. Right? And I think similarly, Hill wants to suggest it's better to set the default in terms of people deserve respect than to set the default that they don't. Especially given that we don't exactly know their rational capacities, empirically speaking, and especially given a nasty history, and especially given that if we don't respect them, we haven't even respected ourselves. The moral system is likely to collapse. Right? So better to in the same way, better to allow a guilty person to go free than to imprison an innocent person. Similarly, the presumption argument suggests that it's better to respect a person who may not deserve it than to deny respect from someone who does. Right? So the upshot of the presumption argument is that it's better to err on the side of granting respect to someone who doesn't deserve it than to deny it of someone who does. We ought to live in ways that respect the basic value and dignity of all people. I wouldn't be surprised if you're confused. I hope that you might be curious by some of the discussion. And so what I encourage you to do, I'll open up a discussion board and I encourage you to post questions, and other folks can weigh in and comment, and I will do my best to weigh in and comment as well. So I thank you for listening to me, and I look forward to class on Friday.